Hi everyone, welcome. These two bins that you see right here in the middle, there are a couple bins that I'm composting in with red wigglers. So this activity of worm composting is got a more fancy name, vermicomposting. And some of my bins have different types of worms. These are just red wigglers. They're probably the more common type of worm used out there. And I guess before getting started with them, I thought I'd share a little bit of information about these two systems. The older bin is the one that's here on the right, and that's the one that's shown here as being 280 days of age. That's 40 weeks today. And this one's been fed 40 times so far. And the slightly younger bin, just a few weeks younger, is 37 and a half weeks, 262 days of age, fed only 19 times versus the 25 here. The reason there's fewer feedings in there is because of what I explained over here on the side and the margin, that these worms were used to film a time lapse where for about a month and a half they were fed just one large object, and that only got listed as one feeding, although it was an entire cantaloupe. So I think in terms of amount of food fed over the span of time, there's probably been an equivalent quantity of food given to both systems. So now, down here at the bottom, you're going to see that it was 10 days ago since we last came in here to check these two systems out and feed them. They got stuff like pumpkin and lettuce, and those are the sort of things you normally don't see last very long in a worm bin. A little bit of coffee, a little bit of worm chow too, so I figured after 10 days they're probably due for feeding, so we're going to get them up on the bench and get them fed. So let's get to work. As you can see, the assortment of foods that I've got for them is quite varied. There's cucumber, there's cabbage, there's mushroom bits, there's tomato bits, there's who knows. There could be a variety of other things in here as well. And it's all frozen, so as the stuff begins to thaw, a lot of it's just going to start dumping out moisture, and it's going to get mushy, and the worms are probably going to just go crazy for that stuff. They're probably going to eat it up quite quickly. And I guess what they got last time is stuff that I assume was probably going to get eaten up pretty quickly as well. It was actually my first time trying to give my worms white pumpkin. I've given my worm bins the traditional orange pumpkin many times in the past. However, the white pumpkin was something that I never had. But it was after the Halloween season had ended that I was just cruising through my neighborhood the night before the trash would get picked up, and I found in front of one of my neighbors' homes a huge pile of pumpkins that had been, not carved up as jack-o'-lanterns, so they were all intact and whole and in good shape. Some of them were large, some of them were small, and a couple of them were white pumpkins. So I grabbed a number of them, almost all of them for that matter, and then I brought them home. I've been gradually carving them up, mainly to try to salvage the seeds with which I like to whip up worm chow. So this worm chow, I actually prepared a fresh batch of it this morning, and a lot of it is pumpkin seed. So now these systems both are pretty far along. They're almost all castings. There's little bits of this and that floating around within each system. Little bits of leftover debris of food bits maybe, or bedding, scraps. But certainly not a lot. And I've got a feeling we're not going to see a whole lot as far as leftovers are concerned either. Just because pumpkin just doesn't seem like the sort of thing that would stick around very long. Or the lettuce bits. My guess would have been that the lettuce bits were probably eaten first. Soon after that was probably the meaty portions of the pumpkin. And then even the skin, I bet, was probably chewed up by this time. These are like little leftovers of tomato that was fed quite a long time ago. Look at all those seeds in there. I got a feeling that this vermicompost, once it gets used out in the garden, is gonna start popping up cherry tomatoes left and right. So here I believe this little see-through piece of material looks a lot like plastic, but I don't think it is plastic. Yeah, it tears quite easily. This is probably the skin of some of that white pumpkin. So I think if we were to just excavate this entire feeding area, we're not going to see a whole lot as far as leftovers from the last feeding. Leftovers we're going to bump into are probably feedings prior to last week's feeding. That was a pumpkin, banana stem right there. This is a piece of corn cob here. So certain things just take a long time. The stem of a banana, the cob of an ear of corn. That's the sort of stuff that you would definitely expect to find as leftovers in your worm bins. And what lasts even longer is artificial materials that don't break down at all in a worm bin. So that's just a little scrap of this blue plastic stuff that keeps popping up in all my bins. Somehow it got into my shredder when I was making some of my prepared bedding, and there's just little scraps of that blue plastic-like material all over the place in my bedding, and every time I spot it in one of my worm bins, I fish it out because I know it's not going to break down. So there's a little bit of moisture in here, and it's causing a little bit of clumpiness. And could this be that little tomato that was still holding out? There was one tomato that was still holding out and had not had its skin burst yet. And this thing looks like it could be that tomato. Remarkably, I'm pretty sure that this was the system where we still had that one last cherry tomato holding out. Although up until just a few check-ins ago, both systems still had one or two cherry tomatoes that were still not yet burst. Still kind of holding out. Definitely squishy, you know. The inside of it was just liquid, basically. There's another stem of a banana. So here and there we're bumping into some leftovers of feedings gone by, but most probably nothing to be seen of the last feeding, unless that little thin piece of the outer skin of the white pumpkin was what we saw earlier. And that might have been it, because that portion of the pumpkin just takes a little bit longer for the worms to break down, but that too, by the next time we come in here, whenever that might be, it'll probably be gone. Here too, a very little thin piece of possibly pumpkin skin right there. So I think we're kind of at the point now where we can begin stacking in today's feeding. And I've been thinking that, you know, this system's getting up there in age, and that it might be time at some point soon to get this system geared up for harvest. You can harvest the castings and round up the worms, get them working on a nice fresh batch of material somewhere. Here too, some of the what appears to be the outer skin of some pumpkin bits. Very, very heavily worked, almost gone, but still showing up as leftovers, remarkably. Alright, let's get this thing going. I've got a couple things in addition to the little scraps of veggies and fruits over there in that other container. I think mostly what we saw was veggies, but I know that there were some fruits lurking in there. I think perhaps 3 or 4 blackberries. And I'm not going to try to go out of my way to really make sure that the blackberries get divvied up between the two systems equally. We're going to just pile in some stuff. And I thought that maybe we would save that second piece of paper for another layer, but the first layer we would just place in some of these leftovers down in the lower section. Mostly corn cob and banana stems, and maybe a little bit of skin from the pumpkin they got last time, but there's really not a lot of leftovers remaining in this system anymore. Here and there you see the leftovers of some of the leaves that have been used as bedding, these little leaf stems. Perhaps this would be a little piece of shredded newspaper, or at least that's what it looks like to me, but certainly not a lot, that's for sure. So I thought that maybe we can start off by getting that first layer established with a little bit of leftover material, and then maybe we can sprinkle in some of my used coffee down low. A lot of times I'll top off with the coffee, but what the heck, let's try to spice up that old food with some fresh food and see if we can draw a little bit more attention to it. I'm sure by placing all of our nice fresh veggies, frozen veggies, right on top of this too will help. Because as those start to melt and kick off moisture, all that moisture will seep down through this old stuff, probably also drawing the worms down in here. And then I usually like to try to dress up the coffee with a little bit of the worm chow. So let's bring in this next paper towel. I think the last time I layered stuff like this, I was using these coffee filters, and they really just did away with the coffee filters. 1, 2, 3. I mean, I didn't see any of the leftovers. The feeding that I did that in was similar to this. A lot of tiny frozen particle matter thrown in between layers of coffee filter, and there was nothing to be seen of the coffee filter. And you know what? Since I've got a replacement feeding zone indicator, this one that was serving that purpose previously, I think can just come in here as supplementary bedding too. So that's pretty nice feeding right there. I guess we can even maybe add a little bit more coffee to it, but before we do that, let's also put in a little bit of this pulverized eggshell to serve as grit. And then I think we can add a little bit more coffee to this. I want to save enough to go into the next system too. Now that I've got a nice freshly replenished batch of worm chow, I can be really generous with this as well. And that's a really nice feeding. I think is probably going to go quick. So let's begin backfilling here. I think something I failed to do during the last check-in, which I've been trying to get myself back in the habit of doing, is verifying that the outskirts of the system are doing good. So I think as part of this backfilling of the feeding area, maybe we'll just keep going. We'll just keep tilling some of the stuff on the very outer edge inwards, just so we can, if nothing else, get it aerated and sort of break up some of the clumpiness that might be developing down there. And usually if you see a lot of worms hanging out there, that in itself is a pretty good sign. So as long as things look good and well populated and sufficient quantity of moisture, I feel like things are doing pretty good out there and there's no reason for concern. So let's do that really quickly on the other side too, and then we could press on to the younger of the two bins that we're feeding. The bins that the bin that I consider to have my so-called original worms in. You might have noticed on the label too that it was labeled as my original red wigglers. And I had a really big problem, maybe more than a year ago now. I don't remember how long ago it was now, where it seemed like my original population of worms had started dying off, one bin after the other, until I had reached a point where the last of my red wigglers had apparently all somehow crashed and burned. Very sad day down here in the wormery. And then I guess I got lucky. I just started poking around and I started seeing some cocoons, and I got a little glimmer of hope. So I gathered what I could as far as worms from that material after I had allowed a little bit of time to pass. And I don't even know if I'm remembering this correctly now. Was it cocoons? Maybe not. Maybe it was just a few worms within the material. I don't even know if there were cocoons. Maybe not. And there was a very limited number of worms that I was able to restart that population with and bring them back to life. So when you see that next bin, you're going to see that it was quite a feat for them to accomplish to get their numbers back up to a respectable amount. So we'll just cover up here and move on to feeding the original red wigglers. Alrighty. These top covering newspapers are holding out pretty nicely as well. A little bit surprising. Usually the worms really do come up and nibble away at that stuff considerably, breaking it all down. And sometimes it is a little bit surprising to see that some of the top covering papers last as long as they do. There's worms over there. Okay, on to the second bin. Let's get them fed next. go. Now, not a lot of difference between these systems, and it's usually in the second system where I pick up the pace a little bit. I usually treat the examination of bin number 1 out of multiple bins as my sort of evaluation of how things are going. But when these systems are running as sort of sister bins or buddy bins like these two are, I usually feel like I can kind of anticipate what's going to be in each system, or at least the systems that follow the first one. Usually they're just buddy bins, like 2 bins to be checked at a time. And I don't know about this piece of paper here. Seems like the top covering newspaper bits were holding out a lot better in the other bin than they are here. This one just doesn't want to hold together whatsoever. This one's holding out pretty good though. Although maybe we'd be better off just using this stuff as supplementary bedding in the feeding area, kind of like we did in the other bin with the recycled feeding zone indicator. And I didn't even see a feeding zone indicator here, but they will be getting one right here. And you know what? I could even use this piece of newspaper as replacement top covering. So, not much to be done here. I don't know, maybe here we can just begin by doing our examination of the outer edges first, and then we'll proceed with dropping in today's feeding for them. Get that out of the way before I kind of get distracted and forget. A little bit drier here, just from what I can tell. I don't know, it does still seem to be clumping together a bit. And there's certainly not as many worms hanging out there as we saw in the other bin, out on this outer edge. I guess I'm just sort of talking out loud here, or thinking out loud, just in terms of what I'm seeing and thinking about. So it just makes me wonder, hey, how come there's fewer worms on the outskirts of this bin versus what we saw in the other bin? And it could just be because of what I mentioned when I first stuck my arm in there, or my hand in there, which was how it felt a little bit less damp. Or maybe it's just further worked down. Maybe there's you know, fewer bits of leftover food and bedding stuff for them to be taking advantage of over there. I guess during those 46 days while the time-lapse was being filmed and they were working on the cantaloupe, they were probably also rummaging around through the rest of the bin and working down the materials. Here too, things feel a little bit drier than what I noticed in the other bin. Kind of unusual. Usually when I'm covering with plastic the way I am in these two systems with the bubble wrap, the moisture within the system remains in the system. Doesn't get lost to evaporation. So I don't know if it's just because it is a little bit drier. Maybe it is. It doesn't look that way, right? When you kind of crumble it around and there's like little clumpy, damp bits here and there. Maybe I'm just imagining, or maybe it was just what was on the surface somehow felt a little drier to me. Doesn't matter. Things are quite nice, though. I just still can't seem to resist wanting to break apart anything that seems a little bit clumpy, a little bit sticking together into a little bit of a ball. And kind of loosening it all up, getting it all aerated. So yeah, things are kind of nice. But it does feel good to know that I've sort of stirred it around, aerated it, and maybe even blended in some of the more dry stuff with more damp surrounding materials. So whatever. Not going to worry too much about it because nothing I saw there is dire. It was just an observation, and an observation I probably wouldn't have even made if it hadn't been for what I observed in bin number 1. But when they're buddied up like this, I can't seem to help myself from sort of comparing what I'm seeing in the two bins. Mainly because I know that I've been handling them so similarly to each other. The expectation, I suppose, is that they're probably very similar to each other. So here again, just some leftovers, I think, already of the last feeding. Some skin of pumpkin. So we'll just, oh wow, that's where all the worms are. I don't know why, but somehow it seems like we don't have fewer worms in this system than the other bin. They're just kind of situated within the material a little differently than we saw in the first bin. So here they're just kind of down in the feeding area, much more so than we saw in the first bin. In the first bin, they were just more everywhere, you know, throughout the entire system. And maybe it was because of what I perceived to be as a little bit more dryness out on the outskirts of this bin. Whereas in the other bin, since there did appear to be maybe a little bit more moisture out on the edges, the worms were just a little bit more comfortable being everywhere within the bin versus what you see here, where maybe they're just gravitating towards the center because there is a greater quantity of moisture down where the last feeding was applied. Lots and lots of worms. You know what? I'm going to let these little guys settle in a little bit, and then we can start piling in their feeding. Well, for the most part, they've sort of receded down into the material, and as far as leftovers go, I mean, we were able to make an entire layer out of the leftovers we found in the previous bin, but here I'll admit I deviated a little bit and didn't really go looking for this stuff, but I see that there are things like leftover banana stem, obviously some of the skin from the pumpkin they got last time, but in the previous bin we definitely encountered all kinds of bits of corn cob and multiple stems of banana. Here we just sort of didn't bother looking for it. Maybe it was because of all the worms I got distracted and just wanted to sort of upend the whole feeding area and see how many worms there actually are down in here. Or who knows, maybe there's fewer leftovers like this. So instead of having a lower layer with leftover food scraps, I guess we'll just try to divvy up the food supply here into two separate layers so that we can use the food as a way to get the worms to break down the paper towel too. And you know what? I think we also talked about supplementing the bedding down in here with some of these paper bits that had been top coverings. So while we were waiting for the worms to dive down, I took that piece of newspaper that I've got with which we can replace the top covering, and I tore it in half so it can flank the replacement feeding zone indicator, although here I don't think we even had a feeding zone indicator. We're not even replacing anything, we're just applying it new. So let's see what we can do about dressing up this feeding area, and maybe by doing so we can draw a lot of traffic out here and make sure that the worms also nibble up that paper towel while they're at it. And here's another paper towel, which is at this point delaminated. It would normally have been a two-layer paper towel, I believe. Alright, so some of the stuff that we see in this little plastic container is beginning to thaw out and get a little bit damp as a result of that, sticking to the plastic. So let's see if we can help some of it out of the plastic container, because it's much better off down here in the worm bin than getting rinsed down the drain. Yeah, that's a nice feeding. Cucumber bits, here's some of that blackberry, some stem of lettuce, even some chunks of tomato, mushroom stems. None of this stuff, I bet none of this stuff is going to last. This end of a cucumber. This is a really nice feeding that I think the worms are going to appreciate. Once again, I'm just going to place a little bit more of this crushed eggshell on as a grit for the worms, and that was the end of my coffee. It almost does seem like we gave this bin a little bit more coffee than we did to the other one, and that's fine. We'll add a little bit of worm chow to this one. This worm chow even had a couple meals of rice over the past few days, resulted in some leftovers, so I think on each occasion it couldn't have been much more than maybe a handful of rice, but I allowed that stuff to dry out, and then I included that in the prep of the worm chow this time. And another thing that I added to the worm chow, which I remember hearing some people mention in the comments of my videos how some people actually take leaves, and sometimes I'll use leaves as just bedding in my worm bins, but I figured I would try adding some dry leaves to this batch of worm chow too. So I added a little bit of that. I got some old pancake mix, so it's whatever's laying around, you know. That's the sort of stuff I like to add. I bought some bird seed in from outside. I just keep that stuff out in the garage for refilling the bird feeders, but I usually like to include a little bit of that in my worm chow too. So yeah, things look really nice in here. But I think we're almost finished. All we got to do is get these coverings in place, the feeding zone indicator, coffee filter, the top coverings of newspaper bits, and back on with the plastic. Kind of wonder, is the plastic on this one perhaps a little bit smaller than it is on the other one, not providing quite as much coverage? Yeah, it does seem like there's a little bit of airflow around the edges here. Maybe that's why we had just a little bit more drying over there, whereas on the other one I think it was a little bit longer and covered better. Such minor differences though, hardly even worth talking about. So that's it for the check-in today with our red wigglers. Both bins are looking great. Both bins are pretty far along as far as their maturity. Kind of makes me wonder how much longer I want to go with these. Might be time to start thinking about halting the feedings, letting them forage for a while, and then setting up some sort of a migration to get them out. But that's for another video in a future time. Who knows when? Maybe a few weeks from now. But I think for now they're going to be happy with this feeding. It was a nice feeding, and I don't think it's going to last. So that's it for the video, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. If you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.